Brandis, the U.S. economy is back somewhat. It grew at more than 6% in the first quarter of 2021 as the combined impact of a mass vaccination rollout and federal stimulus checks triggered a surge in consumer spending. This as President Biden has talked about massive new federal investments and increased tax rates on high-income earners. So how long can this economic boom last? Joining us are Edward Stewart, Professor Emeritus of Economics at Northeastern Illinois University, and Michael Miller, Associate Professor of Economics at DePaul University. Gentlemen, it's great to see you as always. Michael, I'll start with you. U.S. GDP growing at 6.4% on an annualized basis in the first quarter. Does that officially mean the COVID-triggered recession is over?
Well, it took us within 1% of the previous peak, which we hit in March or in February of last year. I think that's close enough to say that we have fully recovered in terms of GDP. This will also give the NBER, who dates the times of the peaks and the troughs, a chance now to set the date for the trough of this pandemic recession, which I think there will be sometime in late summer, early autumn of 2020.
So that's when it appears that the economy would have bottomed out. Ed Stewart,
that's correct.
Let's stipulate that a lot of this is driven by reopenings, by the stimulus package. But when that money runs out, what happens?
Well, the good news is that, and this is one of the things that I don't think a lot of people understand, you see these large numbers of 1.9 trillion, 2 trillion. And most of that money is phased in over a fairly long period of time. So it's not just a one shot. A lot of the stimulus money for education and state and local governments is programmed to last for at least the rest of 2021 and well into 2022. The infrastructure program that's yet to be passed, I think I saw an 8-year time horizon for that. So it's not going to run out anytime soon. And there are also some really interesting numbers in the latest GDP data that came out in Thursday, and then also the personal income numbers that came out Friday, showing how much extra income American consumers have and how much of that they save. So there's a lot of consumer buying power that's still in bank accounts and savings accounts that are there for consumers to spend over a fairly long period of time to come.
A lot of pent-up demand, a lot of positive indicators. Mike Miller, what sectors are doing best right now? What sectors are lagging?
Well, we're seeing the driver of the economy right now is the consumer for several reasons. There is a large amount of pent-up demand for what we call consumer durables, which are things which last more than 3 years. That's cars, appliances, and furniture. And there was a lot of buying of that happening. And then the households have received a fair amount of money from the federal government. The incomes exploded with those $1,400 checks to the large number of households. And they're beginning to spend some of that. Now, a lot of the spending, for example, on leisure and hospitality that was not done during the pandemic, that's gone forever. But people still need the washers and dryers that they weren't buying. So we're seeing that the households are buying. We know that there is a boom in housing. And then if you look at, in terms of GDP, the amount of money spent for non-defense government spending, I think a number I saw was up 44%. Now that's all that redistribution that occurred, which helped stimulate the households to spend more.
And there could be more of that, as Ed Stewart alluded to. Let's hear what President Biden said about a possible infrastructure plan, and then the American Families Plan, and then a plan to raise taxes on high-income earners to pay for it.
I think it's about time we start giving tax breaks and tax credits to working-class families and middle-class families, instead of just the very wealthy. And here's what the American Families Plan doesn't do. It doesn't add a single penny to our deficit. It's paid for by making sure corporate America and the wealthiest 1% just pay their fair share.
So I know both of your philosophies at this point, you might be divergent on this, but first with you, Ed Stewart, the combination of this kind of spending on infrastructure and other things like community college, childcare, coupled with slightly higher tax rates for high-income earners and corporations, how would that impact the overall economy?
Well, I think, obviously, as you alluded, I think it's going to be very, very positive because for many, many years, not just the Trump administration, but back 10 or 15 years, the American economy hasn't invested in classical infrastructure, roads, bridges. The American Association of Civil Engineers said we're several $100 billion deficient in spending on what everybody agrees is infrastructure. And as I've pointed out on this show many, many times, in the United States, we have one of the slowest and most expensive internet systems in the world. So we need lots of investment in redundant and higher grade communications technology. The people in Texas will tell you that we need a lot more in terms of power grid and water systems. And then obviously for the new green technologies and electric automobiles, we need a much more rolled out system of charging stations and electrical power.
Well, I want to bring Mike Miller in on this. What about that tax piece, Mike Miller? And these rates, for the most part, wouldn't even match what they were pre-2017. What impact could that slow the economy?
We got to understand that corporate income tax is less than 9% of the total revenue of the federal government. So increasing it is not going to be a major increase in the amount of revenue we get. I think the president has to realize if the American people have decided or will decide in the near future that we would like to be like Scandinavia, a capitalist economy with a large welfare state, the only tax structure that can possibly deal with that is not to tax the rich. There's just not enough money there. There would have to be a much larger base where people in what we would call the middle class pay rates of 40 or 50% of their income to the government, the way it would be true in, say, Ireland and parts of Scandinavia. Now, maybe that's what the American people want, and if so, we can choose so by picking representatives. I'm not a big fan of that myself, but we have to understand there just is not enough money within the rich to pay for all the plans that we have.
Ed Stewart, I think you might disagree with that. Is that how you see it? There's just not enough money there to tax for the super wealthy?
You're an extremely perspicacious man, Paris.
I don't know if I know what that word means, but go ahead.
It's a good word.
Sharp-sighted, yes. Yes, I think there's more than enough. There was a Rand Corporation study just done that through tax cuts and regulatory changes from 1979 until 2020, the United States has transferred something like 37 trillion from the bottom 90% of the population to the top 10% of the population. The incomes of the upper 1% of the country have grown exponentially. The corporate profits are the largest they've been, a share of GDP since the Second World War. Corporate taxes in the U.S. are less than 1% of GDP. In most other countries, not just Scandinavia, they're at least 2%. So there's plenty of room for corporations to pay their fair share or an average share of tax revenues that most industrialized countries pay.
Well, this is a
My
debate
point would be the progressivity in the United States. It's much more progressive than those other countries where the rich pay a very large percentage of the total pie and the lower incomes pay almost none of the total tax bill.
All right, this is a great debate. We'll continue this at a later date, but we have to leave it there for now. Our thanks to Edward Stewart and Michael Miller for joining us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
My pleasure.